This next part looks at the insulin, and when you measure insulin, insulin is one of our endocrine hormones, and insulin it's never zero. Usually when it's 20 or 40 or 60, those are inflamed levels of insulin. We're looking here at the peak amount of insulin. When people come in fasting and we check to see what is their insulin level at, if I had all the money in the world, I had the most perfect laboratory, and I had an equation that or a team that could take out all of the variables that affect insulin, and it's a lot of variables. We would want a fasting insulin to be somewhere around 5. This means they haven't had food in over 16 hours. The higher the insulin spikes, you really do find a destruction of cells the higher that insulin spikes. Many times I get patients coming in, they know that insulin is really tough on their system, and they'll ask me to measure their insulin. I will tell them, nope, you don't want to do that. We could spend $10,000 studying your insulin, and we still wouldn't have a really good understanding of that for the most part. Insulin is an endocrine system, and it is what is the insulin at a level where you haven't stimulated the body or sparked the body, where you haven't sent a signal to your system, and then what is the insulin level after you've really exhausted the system. And that takes several measurements. Insulin is at least $75 a pop. If I study it in most patients, I'm going to get at least 6 measurements of before the meal and then several times after the meal. And then we want their life perfect when we check it, because there's so many things that screw up. I actually do not recommend you check your insulin. I think it's a waste of money. I think there's other ways to understand what's going on in your system. But for research purposes, I think this study does a great job. So here we have insulin along the side. Again, we don't like it to spike high. We don't like it to stay high very long. And here were the measurements of time along the bottom. There was, 10 minutes before they ate. There was right at the moment when they started eating. And then they get 20 minutes after the meal, 40, 60, 80, all the way up to several hours after 6 hours after the meal. It's really important for you as you watch these numbers to say, well, who were we studying? And these folks were from Seattle. They were healthy. They couldn't be on a diet, and they couldn't be pregnant to be part of the study. And their body mass index had to be 30 or less. That means they couldn't be overweight. Not just we didn't have obese patients, they had to be healthy weight in order to be in the study. So if you look at one of the best predictors of insulin resistance, and body mass index still measures it the best. If you are greater than 30 on a body mass index, that measures your height and your weight and calculates out what are your numbers. If your body mass index is greater than 30, the chances that you are insulin resistant are high. We're going to start by looking at what happened when the patients ate carbohydrates, what happened when they ate protein, and what happened when they ate fat. So let's start with taking a close notice that at time 0 is when they eat, and then we're going to see what happens next. All right, so let's begin with a carbohydrate meal. Again, this is what most of my patients come in eating, and when they have the carbs go in, you will find that their insulin, again, insulin being the hormone, rises very high within about 40 minutes of that eating. As you look at time over that 2, 3, 4 hours later, it takes almost 280 minutes to get that insulin really back to where it belongs in the process. So you say it's still not back to what it was before they started. It wasn't below 20, even 6 hours later. You will find the insulin is probably double from what it was. These patients then fasted all day long, all night long, and the next morning they were given another meal. But while they were studying the insulin, they also looked at several other things. They looked at their triglycerides, they looked at their glucose, they looked at something called ghrelin. Ghrelin is a signal to say, can I eat? And that stimulus for hunger is very much related to how high did their insulin peak. So when people say, why is it that people lose weight on the ketogenic diet? Or I have them come to group saying, I'm on the ketogenic diet because I want to lose weight. Well, I'm doing everything you say. Why am I not losing weight? And part of that is, have you shut down that drive to want food? So here's the carbohydrate meal at time 0. 6 hours later, it's still not back down to its baseline. And boy, oh boy, did it spike really high in that process. What is interesting is how much those inflamed components of insulin were like 4 times as high as I'd want them to be in anybody with inflammation. If you come to me and you have coronavirus or you have cancer like Grandma Rose. As we look at the other thing that I like to show patients when it comes to measuring their insulin, people come in and ask for that all the time, but what I think is powerful is when they start to measure their glucose. So again, glucose is never 0, but these healthy patients, if you look at this study from Seattle in 2008, they started their fasting glucose at as low as 70. Which I think is interesting because a truly fasted state where you have all of your stored glucose spent, you've got your glycogen empty, is always measured in your 60s. 65 is the average, but it's plus or minus 5 from 65. So between 60 and 70 is what we would say you are truly empty of your stored and rapid spending glucose. And I push patients. I'm going to push Grandma Rose to do that here at the end of this podcast. Okay, so glucose, carbs eaten again 0, and watch what happens to these people's glucose. Again, these little squares in my show are supposed to represent glucose, but man, oh man, by 40 minutes, they shot that glucose way up to 140. These are healthy, lean patients. Their insulin works normal. As the glucose trails out for over 6 hours, it does get back under 100, which is healthy. And looking only at their looking only at their blood glucose, you would never actually realize how much insulin it took, how much of that secret endocrine process was percolating throughout their body to keep those sugars controlled. When I have patients come in and they say, yeah, I checked my blood sugar, the blood test says it was only 105. And in my clinic, I say that's an alarm signal. You should not have 105 as your glucose. That means you've had weeks and weeks and weeks of an elevated insulin. And what does that elevated insulin do? It ages you. It destroys mitochondria. It weakens your immune system. It wilts your brain, decreases your mood, and robs you from a bunch of energy. So if you look at those glucoses along that, when they're in the 120s and 130s, I have them all as sleeping because you get your glucose that high and your brain does want to shut off. When you ask, folks, why is a 2 o'clock nap so routine across the world? And it's because across the world for lunch, they have a bunch of carbs. If you want to skip that afternoon low, stop that sugar from spiking so high, and it's not all the sugar's fault. Glucose is the signal for what was happening with their insulin. So if I kind of just put the glucose on mute there, just kind of dampen it a little and then pull back in the insulin and lay it over top of that glucose. Again, these are the folks, lean, healthy people. And they made a bucket of insulin because they had so much glucose in their system when they ate only carbohydrates. As you study them over the several 3, 4, 5 hours, their glucose did get lower, their insulin did come down. But when I have patients of chronic overweight, they've carried that extra 10, 15, 20 pounds for 10 years. I have patients coming in at 350 pounds. They've been 100 pounds overweight for a decade. And as they kind of struggle between, can I use the ketogenic diet to get this weight off, or should I go have a surgeon cut out part of my system? I implore them to say, put yourself in a state of ketosis, give me 6 months. If you don't have reversal of 90% of the problems, I have not lost one person to go have surgery when they've spent 6 months in ketosis. And you get to keep the 50 grand. I mean, that's your money. That's what it costs for these patients to go through this severely life-altering surgery to lose weight. In the process of why am I so adamant about them lowering their insulin, is lowering their glucose and lowering their insulin, is because of the hidden secrets that happen when your endocrine system surges over and above what it's supposed to, and then it never gets to come down. Notice in this patient, these are lean patients, that glucose and insulin went up. I mean, the glucose went up, but the insulin, which is your endocrine system, spiked, and then it went down. Now, I think it's remarkable that it still takes that long for the insulin to go down, but it did actually go down. Many of my patients, they will eat long before that 6 hours is up. They are adding insulin on top of their last dose of insulin. And that's how they show up in my clinic at the age of 40 saying, my blood sugar is only 105. It's not that bad. That's not diabetic. And I'm saying their endocrine system is working against them. It's aging them faster. It's why their brain isn't working correctly. It's why infections are robbing them from the vibrance of their life. So let's compare, again, these healthy patients to what happens when they eat protein. So their protein, or if we're going to first just look what happened to their glucose when they were eating protein. So notice that this meal, again, they'd fasted the day before. They'd fasted since their previous meal 24 hours ago. So they are now at 90, a blood sugar of 90. In my clinic, I would call that too high. I don't want your blood sugar to be even 90. I want it morning fasting blood sugars to be in that 70 to 80 range. Even in the 60s is okay if you've got a good supply of ketones, if you're keto adapted. These patients all were in the 85 to 95 range, so some of them would have made the cut in my clinic, but many of them, it's a range, so they would have. But they're healthy. They have no worries. Patients coming into my clinic, when you look at their fasting numbers, often at the 110, 120, 130 range. And it just means we've had a decade of oversupplying insulin. So as you see the protein response, it does allow their system. Again, people ask me all the time, why don't you promote more protein in your ketogenic diet? And it is because the process of eating protein doesn't fuel the system and really doesn't change the endocrine system nearly as much as I want it to. You'll see the answer to that when I look closely at the insulin. So again, time 0 is when they ate the protein, and when you look at their insulin, it did spike up to not nearly as high as what happened with the folks that had with the meal that was carbohydrates. These are all the same patients, actually. But by 40 minutes, we had a spike of insulin, and we had over 6 hours later, still not back down to what it was at the beginning of that meal. So I think it's powerful for patients to see. I know you're eating all the right things. I know that that meal feels good to you. But if you're looking for the best outcomes, once your body is keto adapted, we have some other additional rules. And it's because of the secrets that go on behind the endocrine system that we ask them to do this. So now finally, let's look at what happens when they eat fat. So again, time 0, we're going to first look at the glucose. Again, they're eating a bunch of heavy whipping cream and butter. But wow, look at that. Their glucose looks almost exactly like it did with the protein. This is really the system emptying some of their stored glucose. My patients would be scolded a little bit for such high blood sugars in the morning. 90 isn't what we want. It is usually much better than where we've been, so scolded isn't probably the right word. But looking at the improvements for getting that blood sugar into that place where I know their liver is finally empty of that glycogen or the stored sugar. So morning fasting glucose for these healthy patients, lean patients, not on a diet, just eating their normal life and not pregnant. Wow, I think it's impressive that their blood sugar was 90. But look at how much insulin it took to keep that glucose controlled. So as you look, that insulin did spike up at about 40 and 60 minutes after eating all fat. When my patients come in and they say, doc, I have been following the rules. I have been eating all fat. I'm on a ketogenic diet. I produce ketones. Why am I not losing weight? And they will have 4 or 5 meals of heavy fat. It'll be a little fat bomb at 3 o'clock. It'll be a few high-fat macadamia nuts at 7 o'clock at night. But they have several meals that stimulated their endocrine system. And from that, this secret life of insulin takes over and locks down their storage. These patients were healthy. They were healthy. Now, I do think it's great to see that for the first, that the fat stimulus of insulin did result in insulin back to its baseline by the 6 hours. But who eats only every 6 hours when you're living a non-ketogenic journey, right? So as you look at what the glucose did and you look at what the insulin did for the fat, clearly the least amount of insulin, the least tax on the body was when there was predominantly fat. So if we lay what happened with the protein, this is again all the insulin results. So the gold ones were the insulin, and then of course that red one is what happened with carbohydrates. The spike of how much insulin taxed their system during the ketogenic or during the meals, and these were healthy patients. If you look at the patients who are overweight, who've been overweight for many years, when we measure their insulins, I never get a 20. I get them starting out the day with 60 microunits per milliliter of insulin. And that is every fat cell is locked down, every liver cell is locked down. Their endocrine system is fighting against them to say, I am not going to release any energy. We have so much stored glucose to use up that until you use up some of the stored glucose, I'm not going to unlock the storage of these other cells, which is why at the beginning of a ketogenic diet, I do a really good job of outlining this in my book and also in the online course. You can see that in the show notes below. But when you look at the dangers that I see patients use in a ketogenic journey, they start out very insulin resistant. They're the folks who say, if I don't lose 100 pounds, I'm going to end up with some bariatric surgery. And then I tell them, I need you to eat as much fat as possible. I need you to eat as many times a day as you feel like. And they're like, what? This is not a weight loss program. But what I'm doing is I'm trying to correct this chemistry. I'm trying to take, I guess it's this way, I'm trying to take those lines of high insulin and pull down, claw them down. So the stimulus for producing insulin, yes, eating does that. In these healthy patients, you can see that even eating fat does that. But in an insulin-resistant patient, there are over 10 times the amount of insulin made. And to reverse that starts with, I have to change the food that you're eating. We need to stop those carbohydrates. It needs to be 20 total carbohydrates or less per day. That's not net carbs, that's total carbs. And what am I doing? I am playing a game with their endocrine system. As I look at how many patients really struggle with that first couple of weeks, they just can't seem to get their mind around, what do you mean? I really crave my carbohydrates. And I'm telling them, deep inside your system, there is a spirit of your endocrine. And it is overworked, it is overproducing insulin, and it is packing on the energy layers. And what that does to your brain, what that does to your aging, what that does to your mind is something that we can reverse, but I have to take control of the endocrine system.
Please subscribe to my channel. And don't forget to click the notification bell so you don't miss out on any new videos. Stay tuned.